So why will we rarely see the full impact of the potential money multiplier? That's because we have these type of leakages. So not a big fan of that word, sounds pretty dirty, but a leakage is the departure of money from the lending cycle because of an action taken by a bank, an individual, a business, or a foreign entity. And when we account for these leakages, it's going to cause the actual money multiplier to be lower than the potential money multiplier. So the actual money multiplier, like the name implies, just tells us exactly that this is what we see in reality, how much new money is actually created when a new deposit comes in once we account for all of these leakages. And we want to go ahead and take a closer look at why these leakages are going to dampen the entire impact of the potential money multiplier. So there are three entities that we need to go ahead and take a look at and see why they are going to be the primary sources or causes of these money leakages. So take a look at the primary causes of money leakages. Leakages. So the primary causes of money leakages, we take a look at entity number one, which are banks. And banks are going to cause the potential money multiplier, its impact, to be dampened just a little bit because they are rarely fully loaned up. So banks do like to hold excess reserves. So banks holding excess reserves. And remember that if banks hold excess reserves, they are not fully loaned up, so they are not lending as much as they possibly can, which is going to tell us that we are not going to reach the full potential money multiplier. And like we said before, there are a few good reasons why banks would not like to be fully loaned up, why they would actually like to hold excess reserves. And one reason is to go ahead and prevent solvency crises. So to prevent a solvency crisis. And a solvency crisis is a unique situation when the bank's liabilities exceeds its assets. When a bank's liabilities exceed its assets. So here, whenever the left-hand side is less than the right-hand side, so when the liabilities are greater than the assets, this is the situation where a bank essentially finds itself bankrupt. And this is a scenario that a bank would like to avoid. So we typically see solvency crises when banks run into some type of sort of liquidity issues, or even during times of recession or bad economic times where they have to write off a lot of their loans. So there's a lot of bad loan debt out there. And when they write off the loans, that's where the bank actually has to go ahead and eat the losses from themselves. And in order for them to eat losses, they need to have some type of excess cash on hand, and this is exactly where the excess reserves do come into play. So just to prevent itself from being bankrupt, just to give itself a little bit of a buffer, banks do like to hold excess reserves in order to prevent these solvency crises. Also, they like to hold excess reserves to prevent bank runs. And bank runs are essentially when everybody goes to the bank at the same exact time to withdraw their money. And once again, we do see this during tough economic times as well. So the bank, remember, is betting on the fact that you necessarily aren't going to go ahead and withdraw all of your money at once, which is why the fractional reserve banking system sort of works fairly well. However, there are times where you might get afraid and say, hey, I want all of my money to be withdrawn from the bank and I just want to hold it near me. I want to hold it under my mattress where I think it's safer. And when everybody believes the same exact thing, that's where a bank run is going to happen. And if the banks don't actually have enough money on hand to give everybody their money because it is their money, then that's where the bank run happens, and that's where it sort of riots begin within the country. Because if we go to the bank and they don't have money, our money, to give back to us, then we'll be very, very sad, and that's where we go ahead and start to riot, and that's where the entire economic and banking system is going to go ahead and be shut down. And we do see a lot of bank runs happening, mostly internationally. So Spain and Venezuela were some of the more recent cases of bank runs, and we still know that Venezuela is still going through it right now. So in Venezuela, when the economic situation started to happen, people went to the banks in order to withdraw their money, and they went all at once. And then that's where the government actually stepped in and said, hey, we don't want this bank run to happen. So in Venezuela, there's very, very long lines to withdraw your money from banks, and there's actually some type of a limit on how much you can withdraw from the banks. So imagine if we had that within the United States, where we had very long lines to withdraw our money, but we could only withdraw a certain amount every single day. And that's a situation that Venezuela finds itself in. And once again, just to prevent this type of scenario from happening, the bank would like to hold excess reserves, which is one of the primary causes of leakages that we do have. The second entity that we can go ahead and take a look at that is going to be a primary cause of leakages are people like you and I. So individuals and businesses. So individuals and businesses holding money in cash. Holding money in cash. So there are a lot of reasons why people like you and I, also businesses and firms, would like to hold money in cash and not necessarily put them into banks. Remember, if we don't put money into the banks, that money cannot be lent out and money creation cannot begin. So here, number one reason why you and I would like to go ahead and hold cash rather than put it into the bank is because we have cash transactions. So cash transactions. So there are still a lot of businesses nowadays, primarily mom and pop stores, that do cash transactions. You can't use a credit card, you can't use a check, you can only do things in cash. So a lot of there are a lot of businesses nowadays and a lot of business opportunities that require cash transactions only, which is why we would want to hold cash rather than put it into the bank. You wouldn't necessarily go to your dealer and say, hey, give me the goods, I'm going to go ahead and give you a credit card or a check. No, it all requires cash transactions. So the same idea with the mom and pop stores as well. So here, number one reason why you and I would want to hold cash rather than put it into the bank is because there are some type of business deals that do require cash. We also might have an innate fear of the financial system. So here, fear of financial system. And this one's a little bit unfounded, but here, if we have an innate fear of the financial system and just banks in general, we're not going to go ahead and put money into the banking system. We're going to hold it under our mattress, hold it near our purses and our wallets. We're just going to hold it and not put it into the banking system. And as we said before, this is going to stunt the potential money multiplier. But as we mentioned, this one's a little bit unfounded because we do have FDIC protection. So even though we have FDIC protection, we have FDIC protection. And FDIC protection, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation protection, just tells us that the federal government actually insures all deposits in banks of up to $250,000. So any account that you open up at a particular bank, it is federally insured by the federal government to $250,000. So if the bank actually goes bankrupt and it goes away and you actually had, say, maybe $100,000 in there, the federal government will step in and say, hey, that is your money. We will reimburse you that $100,000. And this just is going to be protection up to $250,000, so $250,000. So that just tells you that once you hit that $250,000 sort of benchmark, you should probably go ahead and open up a new account or at a different bank, or just open up a new account at the same bank in order to get the full federal protection that we have right here. And then finally, another reason why you and I would want to hold cash is a scenario that we find ourselves in right now where interest rates are near zero. So interest rates near zero. So are near zero. And if interest rates are near zero, that's just telling us that any money that we put into the bank is not going to be generating a whole lot of interest or a whole lot of return. So just out of convenience, you and I would want to go ahead and just hold cash on hand, cash money in our wallets or our purses, and not in the banking system. So if this is going to be the case, we just want to hold cash out of convenience. Finally, we take a look at the third entity that can be cause of these leakages, and that's going to be on the foreign side. So here we take a look at foreign leakages. And foreigners, they can include individuals, businesses, or the governments themselves, but we do notice that in terms of foreign internationally, they all like to hold US dollars due to its stability. So hold US dollars due to its stability. Due to its stability compared to other currencies. So the more and more foreigners that hold US dollars, that just is going to represent a leakage, foreign leakage in this case, because that money isn't actually being put within the US banking system. So as more foreign individuals, as more foreign banks and corporations, as more foreign governments hold US dollars just to sort of give themselves their own type of buffer, it's going to dampen the impact of the potential money multiplier. So three sources of leakages that we have here. We have our domestic banks, we have individuals and domestic businesses, and also foreign leakages as well, which all have the impact of lowering our potential money multiplier. So in order to see out the actual money multiplier, there is going to be a formula that goes along with this as well, where we have the leakage adjusted multiplier, or the actual money multiplier, which is 1 divided by the reserve requirement plus excess reserves plus cash holdings. So here, take a look at the difference between these two multipliers. The potential money multiplier is 1 divided by the reserve requirement, but the actual or leakage adjusted multiplier is going to add in more things into the denominator. And as we add more things into the denominator, it causes the entire fraction to become smaller. So the leakage adjusted multiplier is always going to be smaller than potential money multiplier. So remember, potential money multiplier just tells us what we see in theory, what is the maximum amount of new money that can be created, while the leakage adjusted multiplier is going to tell us what we actually see in reality. So here, if we have that same 20% reserve requirement, remember that the potential money multiplier is equal to 5. But when we add in the leakage adjusted multiplier, so maybe 20% for reserve requirement, maybe 20% for excess reserves, maybe 10% for cash holdings, we get 1 over 0.5, which tells us that the leakage adjusted or actual money multiplier is only equal to 2 in this instance. So in reality, we only see an initial new deposit creating 2 times as much money within the banking system, rather than the potentially or theoretically 5 times as much money with the potential money multiplier. So here, once again, we see the differences and similarities between our leakage adjusted multiplier and the potential money multiplier, and the sources of these potential leakages. So by the individuals and businesses, by banks, and also by the foreign individuals, corporations, and firms and governments as well. With all of this in mind, we have a good idea how banks actually operate, but now we want to go ahead and turn our attention to see how the biggest bank within the United States, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the US, is actually going to operate, and the few pieces that work under it. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that within our next section.